Hello, friends, and welcome to Home is Where the Body Is. I'm Jen, an ADHD woman with EDS, POTS, complex PTSD, and OCD, shaped by an abusive religious upbringing. I spent much of my life feeling like I was balancing precariously over an endless pit, constantly reaching for a stable home that always seemed just out of reach. Today, I can honestly say that home is wherever I am right now, built on the stable ground that's growing out of a deepening relationship with my body and myself. In this podcast, I share the lived experiences that brought me here in case it helps someone feel less alone or supports them on their own journey home. Today, I'm going to start with a quote by Audre Lorde. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. This is, of course, a very famous quote by Audre Lorde. Nick Walker also uses it in her essay on the neuroqueer website called Throw Away the Master's Tools, which I'll get to later. But if you're unfamiliar with this quote, just take a minute to Google it. I also highly recommend Audre Lorde's works. But anyway, the point is, or my understanding of the quote is that she's speaking in terms of slavery, of course, as a black woman, that, uh, well, I mean, it's metaphorical. Like, literally, the master's tools could probably, a slave owner's tools could dismantle his house, but metaphorically speaking, you can't use the tools of the slave owner to dismantle the system of oppression that is slavery. And, similarly, you can't use the tools of white supremacy to dismantle white supremacy. And so in this episode, I'm turning it towards, similar to what Nick Walker did, I'm turning it towards like ableism and disability inclusion of marginalized people, etc. I argue that you can't take the tools of capitalism and use it to make capitalism an inclusive place for marginalized people, for you know, non-neurotypical people, non-white people, etc., etc. DEI initiatives, as typically implemented, don't disrupt the master's house, they renovate it. They select the most palatable, least disruptive representatives of marginalized groups, require them to perform their marginalization on the institution's terms, and call that inclusion. The result is a system that looks like progress while actively filtering out the people who most need systemic change. So, of course, DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in her essay, Throw Away the Master's Tools, Nick Walker applies Lorde's incisive quote to the prevailing pathology paradigm of neurodivergence, arguing that we must liberate ourselves from such a paradigm, moving into the neurodiversity paradigm, in order for real change to occur. And I very much agree with that. And I would like to go even further and argue that the way DEI and similar initiatives are being enacted in the corporate world and the educational world are just another manifestation of the master's tools. And I also want to note that I realize that the current administration made it illegal for many organizations to incorporate DEI. I believe it's like organizations that accept federal funding. I'm not too clear on the details, so don't quote me on that. But I was working at a federal contractor when Trump became president and then instituted all of these new laws or executive orders or whatever they were. And so I did see the effect of DEI being dismantled. at my employer. So I do, recognize that DEI is sort of being dismantled right now. And that is actually part of what led me to this realization, which is the fact that I was weirdly happy that DEI was maybe going to end at my job, which I know sounds weird, but bear with me. When I heard DEI was being made illegal for federal contractors, my first reaction surprised me. I felt something close to relief, and then immediately after that, I felt shame. Was I being spiteful? Did I actually want my colleagues to lose the protections they had, however flimsy? And I sat with that discomfort for a while before I realized the relief wasn't about wanting anyone to suffer, it was something more honest. It was the exhaustion of being asked to perform gratitude for a system that was never actually built for me. The DEI initiatives at my job were not making me safer. They were making the institution feel safer. Safer from accountability, safer from the conversation that we actually need to have. And, safer from actually being required to accommodate employees because the disability accommodation process was really soul crushing. So, some part of me, the part that was tired of pretending, knew that that's why I was feeling relief. And the relief wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. But it took me a while to get there because I do think that as marginalized people, we often are required to perform gratitude. To be like, oh, we're so thankful for this ERG that does nothing for me. ERG being Employee Resource Group. Or, you know, we're so grateful that my employer has pictures of at least one woman in every, like, candid or supposedly candid, right, employee picture thing. You know, how they have, like, brochures with people sitting around a conference table or whatever. But, like, that's not something to be grateful for. Like, that type of performative allyship is not something that we need to be grateful for. So, anyway, I found that the most marginalized people often don't have the energy, access, or institutional legibility to jump through the hoops required to participate in corporate or educational, like at universities, DEI programs. And what I mean by that is like getting involved with the ERG, being on some sort of DEI committee. I've had jobs that had, like DEI committees, that type of thing. Actually getting to lobby the higher ups, you know? Usually the most marginalized people aren't part of that because they're too tired. They're too marginalized. The master's tools, wearing a lanyard and attending a sensitivity training, are still the master's tools. The question being asked isn't why is this house built this way? It's how do we get the right people to feel comfortable within it? Those are not the same question. They will never produce the same answer. Right? Because who, the marginalized people that you can get to feel comfortable within the master's house are typically the least intersectionally marginalized, right? Or, maybe they're disabled, but their family's very, very wealthy, or they're not white, but they're non disabled, cis het, all of these things. Like, we know that intersectionality very much plays a is very much plays a role, is very much a factor. And there's so many things that can affect like privilege and how much you get seen as like a real person to be respected in the workplace versus whether you get dismissed. There's like socioeconomic status as well as like gender and skin color and all of these things. So, anyway, all of that is to say that it's often self-selecting, where it seems to me the company is trying to say, how do we get marginalized people and squish them to fit in to this like image that we want to show the world without actually having to address the concerns of the marginalized people. And so it kind of self-selects for marginalized people who are already kind of getting around in the workforce okay and aren't quite as intersectionally marginalized or anyway, I think you get my point there. It's not random that the people who end up on DEI committees are the ones who are easiest for the institution to absorb. These are specific, identifiable mechanisms doing that work. Respectability filtering, approval gatekeeping, intersectional abandonment. They don't require bad intent, they just require a system optimizing for its own comfort. Right? The higher ups typically are not worried about the comfort of the marginalized employees, but rather their own comfort, the comfort of the stakeholders, the comfort of the company as a capitalist entity. So, to go into more detail on respectability filtering, approval gatekeeping, and intersectional abandonment. Respectability filtering is when DEI selects for compliance. The figureheads are the marginalized people who can most fluently speak the institution's language, who won't make anyone too uncomfortable. This isn't accidental, it's the selection mechanism, right? Like maybe they pick the autistic person who masks the most, who needs the least support, who is the least visibly disabled, doesn't stim, doesn't visibly stim at least, that sort of thing, suppresses their stimming, etc. And of course, I would never blame, I don't, I don't necessarily blame the person who gets put into that position because I feel like they're probably just another marginalized person struggling, you know? And they don't necessarily know that they're being used as a figurehead. For a large portion of my career, I thought that DEI initiatives were great. I didn't really sit and examine them like I've done recently. So, anyway, the point is, I don't want to blame the marginalized people. I want to blame the system who filters for specific types of marginalized people and then uses them as the figurehead. Okay, then approval gatekeeping. ERGs require sign off from the very people they exist to push back against. The oppressor holds veto power over the form resistance is allowed to take. Right? The ERGs exist to push, or supposedly exist to push back against the higher ups, to fight for the interests and the rights of whatever group they represent, right? Like LGBTQ plus ERG. I've seen, disabled ERGs, neurodivergent ERGs, people of color ERGs, etc. So it's kind of a fucked up system when the very people who approve the existence of the resistance are the people that the resistance is fighting against. And then intersectional abandonment. Even within DEI spaces, like I mentioned before, the most marginalized or the most intersectional often get left behind. Like a disabled black woman might be triply excluded because the DEI events aren't accessible for her disability. The committee requirements assume a level of bandwidth she just doesn't have because she's busy masking her disability and, code switching so that the white people are comfortable and dealing with misogyny, etc. And the ERG that represents her, quote, represents her, was built around the needs of people with more privilege and fewer barriers. Like if it's a people of color ERG, it's probably built around men. Right. people of color who are men of color. It's built around like non-disabled men of color. So even in these DEI spaces, people, it often feels like the people who are more than just that one thing, more than just not white, more than just neurodivergent, more than just disabled, more than just a woman, get left behind because there aren't any intersectional ERGs that I've seen. The institutions probably wouldn't approve them because they would be too small. I actually tried to start an ERG once before I got fired. I don't think that's why I got fired. I don't think it had anything to do with it, but you never know. But anyway, there were a lot of requirements, like you had to have a certain number of people interested and people willing to volunteer on behalf of the ERG. And so, you need to have basically the ERG needs to be a big enough category that you can get enough people that the institution will approve it. So anyway, that's why I think like super intersectional ERGs would be very unlikely to happen. Um and another time I got, this was for a different job, there was this application form being sent around to join like the DEI committee for whatever division I was in. And I was like, "Oh, interesting. Maybe this would be cool." And I read it, and oh my god, it read like like some sort of proof of performative allyship. Like it was basically it wanted you to document all the times you'd volunteered. It wanted you to have a bunch of volunteer experience and like, write some essay about how you were committed to DEI and what you had done for DEI in the past and all of these things that sound good on paper, but don't necessarily have to do with the lived experience of being a marginalized person, and also to me read as very unlikely for someone who was, super marginalized, low on spoons, etc., to even have time to do. So, similar to the starting an ERG thing, right? You had to have people who fit that marginalized identity. I guess maybe they didn't have to fit the marginalized identity. I guess they could be an ally, but you had to have people who were willing to fill the volunteer positions of like president and treasurer and vice president, and you had to have a certain number of people who were interested. So, yet again, it's the thing where all the effort is being forced onto the marginalized people themselves. Whereas I feel like if the institution truly cared, they would provide a lot more practical scaffolding, and try to proactively help you find people who are interested, that sort of thing. Anyway, and applications to DEI committees should be based on like lived experience and should also be approved by people who are themselves marginalized. Anyway, I'll avoid going down a rabbit hole on that. But the compliance trap, the whole apparatus keeps marginalized people busy performing inclusion rather than demanding structural change. It's pacification dressed as progress, right? It tries to keep the marginalized people both busy, too busy to do real change, because they're trying to rack up their volunteer hours for the DEI application or whatever, but also pacified, you know, leaving them thinking, "Oh, I'm doing something or the company cares for me at least a little bit," right? But it's not actual progress. It's not actual structural change. Here's what all three mechanisms have in common. And by all three, I mean respectability filtering, approval gatekeeping, and intersectional abandonment. Here's what all three mechanisms have in common. They require the most marginalized people to spend the most spoons to access the least benefit. And the people running the system never have to see that because the people most affected by it never make it to the table. Right? The organization gets to pat itself on the back and be like, oh, look at these happy ERG people. We totally helped them. Meanwhile, the ones who are running out of PTO because of all their sick days or whatever, the ones who are quietly burning out in the corner and don't even have the energy to even think about engaging with the ERG or DEI, they don't have to see those people. And that's the whole point, is they don't want to see those people. The cruelest irony is that DEI can actually insulate institutions from real accountability. When a company can point to its ERGs, its diversity hire, and its inclusion training, it has purchased a kind of moral indemnity. The performance of inclusion becomes the obstacle to inclusion itself. And for those of us who are multiply marginalized, this isn't abstract. It's the specific texture of being told the house has a place for you, while every door requires something you don't have. The committee requires a resume. The ERG requires approval from HR. The accessibility accommodation requires 3 forms and a doctor's note and a meeting with someone who has never been disabled a day in their life. True story. And so, the people who most need the house torn down are the ones least able to show up to the renovation meeting. Not because they don't care, but because the meeting itself was designed, whether intentionally or not, to exclude them. Right? I think there are well intentioned people, like allies or even marginalized people themselves, who maybe aren't intersectionally marginalized or whatever, or have some level of privilege because of their socioeconomic status or something. I do think there are well intentioned people who volunteer for these ERGs, for DEI committees, etc. Oh, and that's the other thing. The institution should pay the people on these committees in these ERGs. They shouldn't just get this free labor. Anyway, I do think that there are well intentioned people who maybe just, haven't done this deep examination that I have over many, many years. And, being pushed out of many, many workplaces and all of these things. So I also don't want to necessarily blame those people, or I don't want to ascribe malintent. Is that a word? I don't want to ascribe bad intent to them necessarily. But I do think privileged people, it's their responsibility to fix their ignorance, So maybe they should go to the marginalized people and be like, is this really helping? And maybe singly marginalized people should go to the more intersectionally marginalized people and ask, is this really helping? All I'm saying is, the road to hell can be paved with good intentions just as much as it can be paved with bad intentions. But my pattern recognition has lost faith in the logic of reforming a system from within. I'm now firmly in the abolitionist camp when it comes to all of the things. The workplace, capitalism as a whole, patriarchal social systems, etc. I prefer to burn it down than reforming from within. And again, I do think a lot of reforming from within has good intentions. And I don't know, maybe it would work, but I've just seen things that are supposed to reform the system from within again and again, and I've just lost faith in it. And I think it's time that we burn it down. Because often in reform, the performance of the inclusion becomes the obstacle to inclusion itself, right? Because we can say, oh, look, we are reforming, then we can just be satisfied with like little changes that aren't actually helping all that much. I think some structures can't be reformed because the harm is the structure. The capitalist workplace is not a system with flaws to be corrected, it's a system whose function is the flaw. Just look at the way, for instance, the tax code takes more money in taxes from like a working class person than it does from the billionaires. Like when Trump and Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, I think, when their taxes were released, and they had some of them had paid like zero income tax in a lot of years. I actually looked up the way that they do that. It's called, I think it's called borrow, and die or something. They keep taking out loans and then repay the loans with new loans, and then eventually they die, and then their heir inherits their stock. Oh, because they use their stock as collateral against the loans, and then they die. Their heir inherits their stock, but because of the inheritance laws, it resets the cost basis of the stock. So essentially, then the heir can sell the stock to pay the debt and not pay a capital gains tax on it. So that is how people like Jeff Bezos or whomever um, buy their yacht without actually paying income tax. So the whole point is the way that the tax code in capitalism, or at least in this country, America, takes more money from working class people than for, like, I have paid more taxes for every year that I've worked than these billionaires have, I think. So it's just wild how um how it points to the fact that the system is functioning as it should. And that is the harm. The harm is the system. You can't really separate the harm from the system. Like, any threat to billionaires becomes a threat to the economy and national security because America, a lot of its power comes from its huge amount of wealth and big economy and all of that. But, like, it's all built on the exploitation of the lower classes. So protecting America is basically protecting billionaires. Anyway, I feel like I need to do a separate episode that really delves into that. It blew my mind when I looked up how billionaires avoid paying income tax. It made me never want to pay income tax ever again. And it blew my mind. But I feel like I should do a separate episode on that at some point. So be on the lookout for that. But the whole point of that is that I think that capitalism and the capitalist workplace can't be reformed because the harm is the system itself. And so there's no way to reform the system in such a way that it doesn't take advantage of the most marginalized and the, most underprivileged. Home, real home, the kind I've been building slowly and imperfectly in my own body and life, can't be found inside a system that charges admission in spoons that you don't have. The path toward actually belonging somewhere runs through refusing to perform belonging in places designed to make you fail. The master's house will never be home. We have to throw away the master's tools, burn his house down, and build somewhere else. As we come to the end of this episode, I want to thank you for spending this time with me. If something here resonated, you're always welcome to reach out or share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to support this podcast, the most helpful thing you can do is subscribe on YouTube and engage with the video. Like, comment, or share it with someone who might need it. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, leaving a review there also really helps. You've been listening to Home is Where the Body Is. I'm Jen, and I wish you a safe journey home.